Okay, so we're getting into the book of Revelation. We have about 12 Sundays, if I counted correctly, accounting for our guests that are coming in on Fifth Sundays. We'll have 2 Fifth Sundays this quarter, I believe, but I think we have 14 Sundays. So 12 lessons for 22 very deep books that have chapters, that have a lot to cover. So I might be moving more swiftly than I'd like to, but I think this can be done. I looked at it very carefully, and I believe we can do it, but we don't want to speed through it to the point that we don't get anything out of it. We do need to take some time for introduction. We'll be looking at chapter 1 a little bit, but only in ways that help us understand how to approach the book. So let's get started with a couple of questions that are on our minds as we approach this difficult book, complex book. First question, of course, is what does it mean? We're looking at a book that's full of symbols, numbers, dragons, beasts, strange characters, angelic beings, demonic beings, and it's confusing. It's written in a style that we're not accustomed to, and a style that is obscure in many ways. But if a lot of the groundwork we're doing this morning will help us crack the code, and it's something that is meant to be understood. So we can answer this question, what does it mean? It may take a little work, may take an approach we're not accustomed to, but we can learn it. The second question is it relevant? God's Word is timeless. Yes, it is relevant. You can get things out of this strange book. Just look at some of the assurances that are given to Christians in this book and decide for yourself if it's relevant. Things like, God sees our tears. You know the line, He shall wipe away every tear from their eyes. That's relevant. Our prayers rule the world. You see, incense that represents the prayers of the saints that are carried by the angels up to the nostrils of God. He hears our prayers. Our death is precious in the Lord's sight, and the glory of heaven awaits. Is that relevant? We will ultimately be victorious. Christ lives and reigns forever and ever. Jesus is coming again for His people to bring them in a rejuvenated state to a rejuvenated world. These are relevant messages. So yes, we can understand it. Yes, it is relevant. Now it's important to get the theme of the book in mind before you approach it. Every symbol, every dramatic event is geared toward this one verse. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for He is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with Him are called and chosen and faithful. That's what it's all about. Victory in Jesus. If you walk away with this with all these theories about things and predictions, and you haven't been dwelling on the reign of Christ and our reign with Him, you miss the whole point of the book. We have to have that in mind as we approach this. Now, let's talk about how to crack the code, starting with the first verse. Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave Him to show to His servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending His angel to His servant John. There's a couple of clues in the first verse that will help us interpret the book. First of all, the word revelation. The title of this book comes from the very first word in the Greek, apocalypsis, which means an unveiling, a revealing, hence revelation. Apocalypsis. From that word we get the classification of apocalyptic literature. You've probably heard that term before. And the book of Revelation is the only New Testament book written in apocalyptic literature. But many Old Testament books have this style. Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah. Those are three primary examples. And it's a specific kind of literature that the first readers of this book were accustomed to, and we're not. Even though we have a lot of examples, and there were many more examples that are non-inspired, written in the time between the Testaments, between 400 BC and the year of the birth of our Lord. So they were accustomed to it. They circulated a lot of this literature around. There were reasons for its existence that we don't understand today. So we need to take a moment just to look at some characteristics of this literature and to get some guidelines on how to interpret it. So let's start with the characteristics of apocalyptic literature. Number one, it is characterized by an intense despair of present circumstances and an equally intense hope of divine intervention in the future. Now, because of that, a lot of apocalyptic literature contains predictions. But as we'll see later on, not all of it is predictive. Some of it is historical, but it has predictions. Number two, the use of symbolic language, visions, and dreams. Go back to chapter 1, verse 1. Notice what John says. He says, "This is the revelation God gave His Son Jesus to show to His servants." We're seeing pictures. This is something shown, scenes. And frequently, John will use this phrase. He'll say, "I saw these things." So it's cinematic. You're going to see visions that John saw in pictures, symbols. That's characteristic of all apocalyptic literature. Number three, it's characterized by the introduction of angelic and demonic powers as messengers and agents in the progress of God's purpose. So you have these spiritual figures that are leading John around or that are doing battle with Christ and His angels, and that's characteristic of this kind of literature. Finally, you have the prediction of a catastrophic judgment of the wicked and of a supernatural deliverance for the righteous, which ties in with the theme, victory in Jesus. And so you have these things that are very important to understand about apocalyptic literature. The highly symbolic nature, the despair of present circumstances. It always seems to surface during times of great persecution. The angelic and demonic agents and the predictions of the destruction of the wicked and the victory of the righteous. Now, why is it so hard to understand? It's purposely cryptic because it comes out of this persecution. It has a message that can be very dangerous for those it's intended. And so you have a situation where if a Christian is seized in an oppressive government and he's carrying this book, it makes sense to his fellow Christians, but it's so enigmatic to the persecutors that they can't tell it's incriminating and may let him go. They may not understand what is contained in the book, and that makes it a little safer for the Christian. Also, the content of the book contains futuristic descriptions of heaven, for example. And heaven is something, it's a place that is spiritual and a place we've never seen. We haven't met anybody who has seen it. And so it's going to be hard to describe with our finite language. We don't have the terms to describe things like God and heaven. And so when we're short on terminology, we fall back on symbols, dreams, visions. That's why it's so hard to understand. But the symbols mean something. And we can get the meaning. We can get the emotional impact. We can get the overall idea. Now, another way to do this is let's look at figurative language in general, especially figurative language in the Bible, and get some tips on how to understand it. Now, these points, these guidelines, have been developed from D.R. Dungan's book on hermeneutics. And I use them not just for Revelation, but for parables, for Old Testament prophecy, just any figurative language in the Bible. You follow these guidelines, and it will be very helpful. Number one, let the author give his own interpretation. In a minute, we'll notice that John says, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, these are the things that must soon take place. Now, he's telling this from the onset. And so we need to deal with that and understand the limits of it and interpret the book accordingly. You don't take that and give a totally futuristic interpretation of the book of Revelation, because John has told us these are things that must soon take place. What did he mean by that? Let him interpret his own book. That seems common sense. Number two, interpret the material according to its general and specific context. What's the context of a book? Victory. We saw the theme of the book, so everything is about victory. What do we mean by the word context? If you right. The word con means with, text, the passage. So the words that are with the text. The placement, Tim said, of the passage you're examining. The context are the things that come right before it and right after it. There's a specific context, which would be the paragraph, the chapter, maybe the book. And then the general context is the overall Bible. And so you don't want to arrive at an interpretation that contradicts the context. You can also look at the historical context, the cultural context, the linguistic context. Those are important as well. Here's a very important one. Compare the figurative with literal accounts of the same subject. Do we have a lot of information in the New Testament that's literal concerning the second coming of Christ? We certainly have some books and passages that are more literal than the book of Revelation. And so when you're seeing something about the second coming of Christ in the book of Revelation, it needs to gel with 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18, 1 Corinthians 15, 53 and following. Those more literal passages will guide our understanding of the figurative passages, because the Bible doesn't contradict itself. It's completely harmonious. John is aware of Paul's letters, and so he is not trying to confuse us. We need to interpret the figurative according to the literal. Next, use established facts of history and biography to assist you in your interpretation. We can know quite a bit about what was going on in John's day when he wrote the book of Revelation. And that will help us understand it. We'll get into that hopefully a little bit this morning. Next, do not demand too many points of analogy. Distinguish the essentials from embellishing parts. Some people have a problem with this idea that there are embellishing parts of inspired literature. But everything in a parable and everything in a vision of the book of Revelation is not meant for us to dice up, analyze, and apply. Some of it's window dressing. That's the nature of the literature. When you're reading a parable of the Lord, you need to ask, what is the main idea? What is the one point of analogy? And everything else goes from that. And so when you're looking at the parable of the unjust judge in Luke chapter 18, Jesus tells you this is about how you ought to always pray and never give up in prayer. So the point of analogy is the woman continually knocking on the door, asking for justice. She doesn't stop until she gets it. The point of analogy is not the unjust judge to the Father in heaven. If you walk away from that and you say, God is an unjust judge who only helps us when we bother Him, worry Him to death, you've messed up the parable. The point of analogy is important. You're going to find that is the case in Revelation. There's a lot of colors and a lot of drama, a lot of heads on dragons, a lot of horns, a lot of fire, a lot of war. It's dramatic. It's meant to be dramatic. It's painting a picture in your head, and you need to ask, what's the main idea of this picture? And not get carried away with details. That's not to say that details can't mean anything. It's just if the details contradict the main idea, you've got the wrong interpretation. Next, many of the scenes in apocalyptic visions are not to be analyzed word for word. They're intended to give overall impressions. So I just went over that. Next, interpret first the major points, then proceed outwardly to the minor points, and do so with reservation. So that's what I've been talking about too. You start with the major points. Start with what it's all about. Then work your way out. And do it reservedly. Do it with caution. Don't be cavalier about your interpretation. This isn't for conspiracy theories. This is God's truth. It's important. Next, if there is an apparent inconsistency, revisit your interpretation until a reasonable meaning is discovered. So, when you're reading a text, it's good to start with a literal idea, not necessarily in the book of Revelation, but in general. And if the literal interpretation presents a contradiction, then you need to consider this could be a symbol. And what I mean by inconsistency here is it's inconsistent with other scriptures or it's inconsistent with reality. There are some things that are literally absurd. A dragon with 7 heads is absurd. You know that's not a real thing. It's got to be a symbol. And so make sure your interpretation is consistent with reality and with Scripture. Both those have to be the case. Here's the final one. Figures are not always used with the same meaning. In 1 Peter 5:8, the lion represents what? Satan, the devil. But in Revelation 5, the lion is a lamb, is Jesus, the Lion of Judah. So every time you see a lion, you're not going to think the devil. You're going to look at the context. You're going to look at the other scriptures. You're going to compare and you're going to interpret it accordingly. There are some things about a lion that are like Jesus, and there are some things about a lion that are like the devil. And those symbols can be fluid, mixing from one to the other. That's what the Bible does. It's not a contradiction. It's just how this symbolic literature works. So there's some guidelines and characteristics of the kind of literature we're going to be looking at, and it's why there's such an interest in this book. It's different than what you're used to. And sometimes we like a change. We need to be careful with it and not get carried away and take from it what God intended. Any comments or questions? I can take a break here if anybody wants to add anything to it. Larry.
Verses 1 through 3, I've got a note here that we need to learn to read responsibly.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, we read, we hear, and we keep.
Read, hear, and keep. Reading responsibly. That's good. That summarizes everything we're saying. Read this responsibly. Treat God's Word with care. Let's talk a little about the historical context. Now, John, going back to verse 1, These are the things that must soon take place. There are three basic approaches to the book of Revelation. One is historical. There are some people who think everything in this book has already happened. And you might say, well, I know about heaven. That hasn't happened yet. And they would say, well, there are some people who are already in heaven, and so that has been taken care of. Well, what about the second coming of Christ? Well, they'll interpret that symbolically. They'll say the coming of Christ was the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And there are some passages in Matthew and other places that speak of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem as the coming of Christ. But it's like the lion. Every time you see the coming of Christ, it doesn't mean the same thing. Sometimes it's the day of the Lord at the end of time. Sometimes it's the destruction of Jerusalem. Sometimes it's the day of Pentecost, Joel 2. So you have to look at the context. So some people say everything in Revelation has already happened. It's all over with. We look at it from a historical point of view. Some people say nothing in the book of Revelation has happened yet. And this is a futuristic view of the book of Revelation. And they might see some events as something that occurs in our timeline, this side of the coming of Christ, but still in the future. There's some people that are looking at the war in the Middle East today and saying, I saw this in the book of Revelation. And here it's in this detail right here. And it's finally coming to pass. Well, they've been saying that about every flare-up in the Middle East since the 40s or before then. And so that there has to be a problem when you keep missing the interpretation. But everything is future. Many things are coming to pass at the end of time. Now, I think the best approach is a blend of these two. To acknowledge that many of the things are historical and many of the prophecies are futuristic. And only when you arrive at that do you solve most of the problems. I don't want to please don't get the idea that I've got this all figured out. There are going to be a lot of passages that I'm going to say, I don't know, what do you think? And I want you to study with me. Because honestly, I've looked at this book for years, and there's some passages that are very difficult. And every interpretation I can think of has a problem. And so I just have to shrug my shoulders and say, I think the immediate readers understood this, and it was intended for them. I don't know it, but we're going to be okay. And that's the end of it. But these things must soon take place. That means that some of the events are historical. Folks, the immediate audience had some applications. This has a relationship to the first readers as well as us today. The book of Revelation wasn't just for people who lived 2,000 years after it was written. It was also for the people who were living in the days of persecution in the times in which this was written. And that's why John says these are things that must soon take place. Now, it's obvious, I think to everyone, that the book is set during a time of great persecution against the Christians in the Roman Empire. The question is, at what time in the Roman Empire was it written? Some people say it was before the destruction of the temple, and many of these people have a largely historic view of the book of Revelation, and I believe it was written near the end of the first century, about 96 AD. I'm going to lay out why, but I'm also going to give some cultural background to this book. If you like history, you'll like this part. If you don't, try not to fall asleep. Okay, so Rome. Rome started out as a city founded in the mid-8th century BC. Early Rome was ruled by kings. But after about 400 years, the Romans took over the city and took things into their own hands. And beginning in about 509 BC, it was ruled by the Senate. It was a republic. A lot of our government is based not only on Rome, but on the Greek city-states and their form of government. We're a republic today. And so they were ruled by this council called the Senate. And from this point forward, it's called a republic. Now, the republic lasted almost 500 years, twice as long as we have currently existed as a nation, this being our 250th year. So you hear about the fall of Rome all the time, not realizing it lasted twice as long as we have lasted. We're still a very young nation. But what happened is, in the 3rd century, Rome grew to be the preeminent city on the Italian peninsula. And during the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, Rome's stature increased as it became the capital of an overseas empire for the first time in history. Now, in January 49 BC, nearing the time of the birth of Christ, Julius Caesar became dictator for 4 years. Now remember, it's been run by the Senate. So do you think that was a very popular thing with this council of senators who'd been in charge for 400 years or 500 years or so? It wasn't, and so it ended in the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. And then the Senate tried to reestablish the republic. But the champions of the Senate, Brutus and Cassius, were defeated by the allies of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Caesar's nephew, Octavius. And in 44 to 31, there's this power struggle back and forth between the friends of the Senate and the allies of Caesar. And it ended with the victory of Octavian, who was later known as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Now, he took charge in 31 BC and became the sole ruler of Rome. And as emperor, he wore this title, Augustus. During the 1st century AD, which is when the Bible was written, and the events of the Bible when the events of the Bible happened, during that 1st century, there were something like 11 Roman emperors. I'm not going to go through all of them. The first was Caesar Augustus, 27 BC to AD 14. We believe that the book of Revelation was written during the reign of this 11th emperor, a guy named Domitian. Now, one of the reasons we believe this is a very important footnote from an early church father, church leader in 185 AD named Irenaeus. And here's what Irenaeus said. If it had been necessary that his name should be publicly proclaimed, he's talking about the beast in Revelation 13. So if it had been necessary that the name of the beast should be publicly proclaimed at the present season, it would have been uttered by him who saw the apocalypse. Him who saw the apocalypse would be John. For it was seen no such long time ago, but almost in our own generation, at the end of the reign of Domitian. That's a pretty powerful testimony. He's talking about the one who saw the apocalypse as if he were somebody that he was intimately acquainted with. And that's because Irenaeus was a student of a man named Polycarp. Polycarp was a student of the Apostle John. You're looking at a grandson in the faith of John, just 2 generations removed. He lived in 185 BC. John died near the end of the 1st century. He's very close to the writing of the New Testament. I find it hard to ignore this testimony. It's not inspired testimony, but I find it hard to ignore this in the face of people living today who say they know the book of Revelation was written before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Well, Irenaeus lived a lot closer than we do. And it's something not to be ignored. And he wasn't the only one who claimed this. Many other church fathers followed his lead in saying the book of Revelation was written during this time. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because the world was a little different at the end of the first century than in the middle of the first century. And the circumstances were different. And the relationship to Judaism was different. And the state of Christianity was different. And if we want to interpret the personalities involved and some of the symbols, and if we want to get it right, we need to have the right point in history. So why was the church persecuted during the reign of Domitian? Well, here's what happened. The first line of Caesars was a part of the Julian Claudian dynasty. A dynasty is a family of rulers. So they all came from nobility, from people who were related to senators. You can see how that was a compromise between the Senate and the emperors, is have people from our own descendants reign as emperors. Descendants of Julius Caesar, descendants of Claudius, all nobility. But there came a period of civil war in the year 69. And during that year, there were 4 different emperors. That's not good for a country, right? You imagine a succession of leaders like that in our country. It would be torn apart. But there was a strong man that came in, a military general named Vespasian. He came in and he brought peace. He conquered all the other rivals and ascended to the throne of emperor. His name was Vespasian. Now after him, his son Titus, another military general, took the throne. Titus is the Roman emperor who destroyed the city of Jerusalem in 70. And so we know him biblically for that devastation on Jerusalem and the temple. He destroyed the temple, Jerusalem, ransacked the area, ended the burnt offerings in Jerusalem from that point to today. Very pivotal moment in the world history. Titus didn't reign very long. I think he reigned until 81. When he destroyed Jerusalem in 70, he was not emperor. But he followed his father Vespasian, and then his brother Domitian took the throne. Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, that is called the Flavian dynasty. Now, it wasn't very popular. Why do you think it was unpopular? Anybody got any idea? These were not nobles. These were not descendants of the Senate. This is not the Julian Claudian dynasty. It was the Flavian dynasty. These were military commanders, almost like a militia taking over. The senators wanted to go back to royals, people of noble blood. And so there was a fight for something historians call legitimacy. Now, in this era, where people were very superstitious, what's a good way to gain legitimacy with the populace? There was something called an imperial cult. The imperial cult was the worship of emperors. You know, you remember when Paul came through Athens, there was an idol for everything, including rulers, including emperors. And by the days of the Flavian dynasty, Domitian in particular, the religion of emperor worship was established, well established. So if you're coming in and you need legitimacy, and there's already an imperial cult, why not just enforce this idea that you are a god? Who's going to overtake you then? So it's pretty clear, and this is challenged by people, but it's pretty clear from the history that Domitian took advantage of the imperial cult. Now, it wasn't that successful in Rome. Romans were a little more sophisticated, you could say, than to worship their own emperor. Many of them did, but it was very successful in outlying provinces like Asia Minor, where all the churches in the book of Revelation exist. Now, to back this up, I'm not going to press this point too long, but let me just give you a few comments from historians that lived in those times. This is Dio Cassius. Domitian even insisted upon being regarded as a god and took vast pride in being called Master and God. These titles were used not merely in speech, but also in written documents. Who could deny that emperor worship was a problem? Quickly run out of time. These are more testimonies to this. You can look this up later, but there are many people who said this. Now, here's the kind of thing that was going on in the empire. I want to read this. This is concerning emperor worship in Asia Minor. This is after Domitian's reign, but around a time during the reign of Trajan. This lawyer named Pliny, who lived in Bithynia in Asia Minor, writes to the authorities about a problem he's having in Asia Minor. He says, I interrogated them whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question twice again, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they still persevered, I ordered them to be executed. For whatever the nature of their creed might be, I could at least feel no doubt that contumacy and inflexible obstinacy deserved chastisement. There were others also possessed with the same infatuation, but being citizens of Rome, I directed them to be carried thither. So they were being put to death for not offering a pinch of incense as worship to Caesar. Now, Jews were not pressed this way because they were an established religion. But people were very suspicious of the Christians. And so Christians in Asia Minor in particular were being put to death over refusing to bow down to a human emperor. And this serves as the background of this book. And all of it was really not about Domitian really thinking he was a god, but over his needing legitimacy with the Roman Senate. If he could become popular enough with the people, they'd leave him alone and let him be emperor. And so he was using the imperial cult to that purpose, which put major pressure on the Christians. John says in Revelation 1:9, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. At the end of his lifetime, John was an elder of the church in Ephesus, which is on the shore of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. That red area is the area that is containing all 7 of the churches of Asia, Ephesus being one of them. And Patmos, you can't see it from where you're sitting, but it's right off that western tip of Turkey, then Asia Minor. It's a little island about 4 by 6 miles, and it was used as a penal colony. And testimony from historians say that people were bound in shackles, given very little food, and they were put in forced labor. These were the conditions John found himself in at the end of his life when he was in his 90s. Now, John was the only apostle who died a natural death, and some people think he was fortunate in that regard, but you think about being in your 90s and living in that kind of suffering, you would rather have suffered a different fate than that. Verse 4, John to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is, who was, and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne. So here we have the people to whom the letter is addressed. 7 churches. The number 7 is going to come up over and over again, or multiples of it. It's a special number, noting divine perfection. So you could look at this as 7 churches, but you could also look at it as a subset representative of the whole, then and now. I think that's the way we should look at it. We find ourselves in one of the seven or in each of the seven churches. And as we examine the letters in the next few weeks, we'll see a lot of relevant lessons that we can apply to ourselves today. That's a basic introduction. Does anybody have a question or comment you want to raise in the last few minutes here? All right, if that's it, we will be dismissed.